Greetings, Boogie fans! Michael here, and a few weeks ago, I made a video talking about what the rarest Pokemon in every main series game was. That video did really well, so thanks for that. So I wanted to make a video of a similar format, but instead of the rarest Pokemon, I wanted to find out what the strongest Pokemon in every main series game was. Before I dive into the list though, I have to define what exactly counts as a game's strongest Pokemon. In previous videos that I've made ranking the strongest Pokemon of some certain category, I've done that ranking strictly on their base stat total. I did that because trying to figure out which one is the best at battle when there's all these different battle formats and factors, it just made things too subjective, and I wanted to have a ranking method that was strictly numerical. However, using this exact method would make this video kinda dull, because then it would just be, oh, what's the highest base stat total Pokemon as of each generation? So, to make things more interesting, I am defining the strongest Pokemon in a particular game by which Pokemon is the strongest at the moment you obtain it. In other words, I'm taking into account the Pokemon's level at the time that you obtain it. To measure this, I've created a pretty simple metric that I am calling the Strength Score, which is simply the Pokemon's base stat total multiplied by the level at which you obtain it. So, for example, if you catch a Sandshrew at level 10, since its base stat total is 300, that means its strength score is 3000. The strongest Pokemon in a particular game is the one that has the highest strength score. Since the state of the Pokemon at the time of obtaining it is what matters, that will by default exclude Mega Evolutions. Additionally, I'll be excluding Pokemon received through Mystery Gift because so many are sent at level 100, so that just skews everything in a dumb way in my opinion. For Pokemon to be eligible, you have to be able to capture it or receive it within the game itself. So that covers all of the necessary intro stuff, so let's go ahead and get started by diving in with the strongest Pokemon in Red and Blue, which is, of course, not Mewtwo. Mewtwo is found at level 70 in the basement of Cerulean Cave. Since it has a base stat total of 680, that times level 70 results in a strength score of 47,600. That is a very high strength score, and is actually the highest strength score of any Pokemon that you can catch in these games. But there is another way to obtain Pokemon in Generation 1 that isn't catching, and that is the in-game trades. Since the in-game trade Pokemon that you receive match the level of the Pokemon that you send, it is therefore possible to receive level 100 Pokemon from these in-game trades as long as you send them a level 100 Pokemon. With this method, you can obtain Pokemon with a higher strength score than Mewtwo. In Red and Blue, the strongest Pokemon is an Electrode named Doris. If you trade a level 100 Raichu to the NPC in Cinnabar Lab, you will receive a level 100 Electrode. Electrode's base stat total is 490, so that times 100 results in a strength score of 49,000, over 1,000 strength points higher than Mewtwo. This is the only in-game trait in Red and Blue that can result in a strength score higher than Mewtwo's, because all of the other ones don't have base stat totals that are high enough. Since you're multiplying it by 100, they have to have a base stat total of at least 476 to beat the 47,600 score, and only Electrode has higher than that. In Yellow version, the in-game traits are different, but this time there are actually two that can result in a higher strength score than Mewtwo's. The first is receiving a level 100 Rhydon in exchange for a level 100 Golduck, but that's not the strongest one. The strongest one is receiving a level 100 Muck named Sticky in exchange for a level 100 Kangaskhan in the Cinnabar Lab. Since Muck's base stat total is 500, that means its strength score is 50,000, again, higher than Mewtwo's. Who would have thought that Mewtwo would lose out on the strongest Pokemon title to a pair of Pokemon named Sticky and Doris? Hey, so those of you who are very knowledgeable Pokemon fans have probably already figured out that this isn't quite correct. That's because I made a mistake and failed to account for the special stat in Generation 1. Back then, special attack and special defense were just one stat, so the base stat totals of all Pokemon are completely different than they are in any other generation. Since Mewtwo didn't have its special defense stat of 90, its actual base stat total was 590, meaning its strength score was 41,300. Electrode's base stat total was 400, so its strength score was 40,000. Muck's was also 400, again with a strength score of 40,000. Therefore, neither of them are actually stronger than Mewtwo in Gen 1. So Mewtwo gets the strongest crown in red and blue, but not actually yellow. The Rhydon trait I mentioned is less impacted by the alternate stat system because its special defense stat is low. So its Gen 1 base stat total is 440. That's a strength score of 44,000, meaning it is the strongest Pokemon in yellow. Now on to Generation 2, where the situation is actually the same, where the strongest Pokemon seems like it would be the level 70 legendaries, but it's actually level 100 Pokemon from in-game trades. In Gold and Silver, the strength scores to beat are those of Lugia and Ho-Oh. They both have base stat totals of 680 and can be caught at level 70. Lugia at level 70 in Gold, and Ho-Oh at level 70 in Silver. These have the same strength score as Gen 1 Mewtwo, that being 47,600. But there are several in-game trade Pokemon that can surpass this number, the strongest of which is Aerodactyl. If you trade a level 100 Chansey to an NPC named Kim on Route 14, she will give you a level 100 Aerodactyl named Aeroy. Since Aerodactyl has a base stat total of 515, this results in a strength score of 51,500. In Crystal version, the legendary strength scores are actually easier to beat, because you catch Ho-Oh and Lugia at level 60 instead of level 70. However, the strongest Pokemon is actually the same as Gold and Silver, because the Chansey for Aerodactyl trade remains the same, and there were no other in-game trades that give you a stronger Pokemon. So, therefore, Aeroy the Aerodactyl is the strongest Pokemon in all 3 Generation 2 games. Now on to Generation 3, starting with Ruby and Sapphire, and the strongest Pokemon is actually not an in-game trade Pokemon this time. There are only 3 Pokemon available from in-game trades, and the one with the highest base stat total is Corsola. However, its base stat total is only 410, resulting in a strength score of 41,000 at level 100. And this is not the highest in these games. The strongest Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire is actually a legendary this time, and it is Rayquaza. It is found atop the Sky Pillar at level 70, so like the other legends we've discussed, that means it has a strength score of 47,600, far and away the largest in these games. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, the situation is virtually identical to Red and Blue. Mewtwo is again available at level 70 in Cerulean Cave, but the in-game trade at the Cinnabar Lab of Raichu for Electrode is still available. This once again means that you can get a level 100 Electrode with a strength score of 50,000, which is higher than Mewtwo's. Things get a little bit more complicated in Emerald though. At first glance, it seems like the strongest Pokemon would be the level 70 Rayquaza, just like in Ruby and Sapphire, because again, all the in-game trade Pokemon have low base stat totals. However, it's actually possible to capture 2 other level 70, 680 base stat total Pokemon in Emerald version. You can do this in Fire Red and Leaf Green as well, but that doesn't matter because the Electrode would still beat the strength score of these Pokemon. If the player received an item known as the Mystic Ticket, that allows them to travel to a location called Naval Rock. In the basement, the player can find a level 70 Lugia, and at the top they can find a level 70 Ho-Oh. As I mentioned, since Lugia, Ho-Oh, and Rayquaza all have the same base stat total and are all found at level 70, they all have equal strength scores of 47,600. But my problem with this is that I'm not really sure whether Ho-Oh and Lugia should count for Emerald version. I did say at the beginning that I'd be excluding Pokemon received through Mystery Gift, but that isn't technically what happens here because you don't receive the Ho-Oh and Lugia, you receive the item that then allows you to go and find them and you still battle and capture them yourself. So, should that be excluded? I couldn't really decide on whether they should count or not, so I figured I'd let you guys decide. If you think that Ho-Oh and Lugia should not count, then Rayquaza is the strongest Pokemon in Emerald, just like in Ruby and Sapphire. If you think that they should count, then it's a 3-way tie between Rayquaza, Ho-Oh, and Lugia. Up to you. Before I move on to Generation 4 though, I wanted to talk about the strongest Pokemon in the spin-off games of Colosseum and XD. They are not main series games, but they have the same battle mechanics and you can actually trade Pokemon between these games and the main series games of Gen 3, so I figured they deserve to be included here. I didn't include them in the rarest Pokemon video because in that video I was excluding Pokemon that you could only receive a predetermined amount of, and that is the case for every Pokemon in Colosseum and virtually every Pokemon in XD. The only ones that you can get multiple of are the Pokespot Pokemon, and that's like a total of 9 different Pokemon, and that didn't seem worthy of including. The strongest Pokemon in Pokemon Colosseum is Ho-Oh, obtained at level 70, the highest level available in the game, and also with the highest base stat total. Obtaining it is not a simple process though. To get this Ho-Oh, you have to have completed the main story, purified all 48 Shadow Pokemon, and then defeated all 1 trainers on Mount Battle within the game's battle mode. It's very time consuming to the point where I have never done it myself, but it is still possible, and you could still get the Ho-Oh today, so Ho-Oh is definitely still the strongest Pokemon. And then next is Pokemon XD. This game does have in-game trades, but none of these Pokemon end up being the strongest, simply because their levels are actually all set to level 20. So they aren't going to be messing things up for this game. As a nice counterpart to Colosseum, the strongest Pokemon in Pokemon XD is actually the Shadow Lugia. You snag it at level 50, and since Lugia's base stat total is 680, that means it has a strength score of 34,000. It did not win this strongest Pokemon title by very much though. There was a second place Pokemon that was very close. That Pokemon is the Shadow Dragonite, which you can snag in the post-game at level 55. Dragonite has a base stat total of 600, which means its strength score is 33,000, just shy of Shadow Lugia's 34,000. Now on to Generation 4, starting with the Sinnoh games of Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. These are actually in a very similar situation to Emerald version, where all of the in-game trade Pokemon are weak, so they don't affect anything here, but the strongest Pokemon is actually a legendary that I'm really not sure should count or not. If you obtain the item called the Azure Flute from an event, you can bring it to Spear Pillar and access the Hall of Origin. There you can battle and capture a level 80 Arceus. Not only is this a super high level, but Arceus also had the highest base stat total of any Pokemon form at that point in time, that being 720. This results in an astronomical strength score of 57,600. But like I said, I'm not really sure whether Arceus should count here or not. Not only is it only catchable due to an event item distribution, like the Naval Rock situation with Ho-Oh and Lugia, but the item used to trigger the event was never actually distributed. Therefore, it has never been possible to catch an Arceus in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum without hacking the game. We only know about it because, well, we hacked the game. So again, I will leave that decision up to you. If you think that Arceus should count, then it is by far the strongest Pokemon in the Sinnoh games. If you think it should not count, well, then the strongest Pokemon depends on the game you're playing. In Diamond and Pearl, there are multiple level 70 legendaries available, but the one with the highest base stat total is Giratina. Like so many of the other Pokemon we've discussed before, it has a base stat total of 680, meaning it has a strength score of 47,600. In Platinum, since you catch Giratina far earlier in the game and at a much lower level, the strongest Pokemon is instead a tie between Dialga and Palkia. They too have a base stat total of 680 and are caught at level 70. Fun fact, none of these Pokemon are actually the highest level available wild Pokemon in Platinum version, not even Arceus. That's because in the resort area, if you fish with a Super Rod, you have a chance to reel in a level 100 Magikarp. Although, it's still not the strongest Pokemon because it only has a base stat total of 200, so that means its strength score is only 20,000, which is not nearly large enough, but it's still funny, so I wanted to say something about it. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the situation is similar to their predecessors, where the strongest Pokemon is a level 100 in-game trade Pokemon that surpasses the strength score of the level 70 legendaries. If you're curious as to what those level 70 legendaries are, they are Lugia and Mewtwo in Heart Gold, and Ho-Oh and Mewtwo in Soul Silver. There are not as many strong in-game trades as their predecessors though, and there's actually only one that can result in a higher strength score than the legendaries. That trade is Rusty the Steelix from Jasmine. She will accept any species of Pokemon, so if you trade her any level 100 Pokemon, she will give you a level 100 Steelix. Steelix has a base stat total of 510, resulting in a strength score of 51,000, making Rusty the strongest Pokemon in the Johto remakes. Now on to Generation 5, the first generation in which the levels of the received in-game trade Pokemon are actually set. These levels don't get higher than level 60, so these Pokemon won't be taking any more strongest Pokemon crowns from here on out. In Pokemon Black and White, the strongest Pokemon is Kyurem. It can be found at level 75 in the Giant Chasm, and since it has a base stat total of 660, that makes its strength score 49,500. Kyurem gets this crown because while it has a lower base stat total than Reshiram or Zekrom, the latter two are caught at only level 50. In Black 2 and White 2, you might expect that the strongest Pokemon is also a legendary because, as I said, in-game trades aren't a factor anymore, but it's actually not a legendary. The strongest legendary Pokemon available are Zekrom in Black 2 and Reshiram in White 2, both at level 70 with a base stat total of 680, which gives the strength score of 47,600. Yes, I've repeated it several times. But Black 2 and White 2 feature wild level 100 Pokemon, and just like in Platinum, that Pokemon is Magikarp. If you fish in the Nature Preserve, an area that you only get access to if you have seen every Pokemon in the Univadex, you can fish up a level 100 Magikarp. However, like is the case with Platinum, Magikarp doesn't get a strength score high enough to be counted as the strongest Pokemon. But Gyarados does. If you fish in a rippling water spot within the Nature Preserve, you can reel in a level 100 Gyarados. Since Gyarados has a base stat total of 540, that means its strength score is 54,000, the highest score I've covered in this video so far, excluding Arceus. That means that this level 100 Gyarados is the strongest Pokemon that you can obtain today in not just the first 5 generations, but all of them. Now on to Generation 6, starting with X and Y, and the strongest Pokemon in these games is actually Mewtwo. Yep, it took until Generation 6 for Mewtwo to get the strongest Pokemon crown in any of these games, according to my system. You find Mewtwo in the Pokemon Village Cave at level 70, like all of its other appearances. By now you already know that it has a 680 base stat total, resulting in a strength score of 47,600, so I don't really need to tell you that. Well, I guess I just did. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the strongest Pokemon is Deoxys. There's no decision making in regards to events for these games because you get Deoxys through regular gameplay. You encounter it at level 80 and it has a base stat total of 600. This results in a strength score of 48,000, just edging out Rayquaza's strength score of 47,600. Now on to Generation 7, starting with Sun and Moon. The strongest Pokemon in these games is Necrozma. It's found at level 75, so with a base stat total of 600, that leaves Necrozma with a strength score of 45,000. This strength score is a bit lower than a lot of the other ones we've discussed simply because Necrozma's base stat total is only 600. The 680 base stat total Pokemon, Solgaleo and Lunala, are caught at a much lower level of 55, and that simply isn't high enough. In Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, however, things become a freaking mess. That's because they made virtually every legendary Pokemon ever available in these games. So we end up having a tie between a ton of different Pokemon for the strongest Pokemon slot, because there are a bunch of 680 base stat total Pokemon obtained at level 60. So they all have a strength score of 40,800. Those found in the Ultra Wormhole are Mewtwo, Lugia, Ho-Oh, Rayquaza, Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, Reshiram, Zekrom, Xerneas, and Yveltal. Pronunciation intentional. If you don't understand why, watch Pokemon Talk number 8. In Ultra Sun, Solgaleo is also a part of this tie, and in Ultra Moon, Lunala is there instead. And finally, the strongest Pokemon in Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee is Mewtwo. Like with so many other games, it is found at level 70 in the basement of Cerulean Cave with the strength score that I really do not need to repeat. It's the highest level Pokemon available, and it has the highest base stat total of all Pokemon in the game. This particular contest isn't even close. That wraps up this video, so if you enjoyed this video, you should definitely subscribe to my channel. I'm not too far from 1 million subscribers, and I would like to hit it soon, thanks. Thank you so much for watching, and an extra special thanks to my patrons on Patreon. If you guys want to help support the channel and support me and get some cool perks too, you can check out the link in the description below. Also, if you enjoyed this video and want to see some more of my fun Pokemon content, I recommend this video here. Alright, that's all I have for now, so until next time, Pokefans, gotta catch them all!